Hi, this is Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, and you're listening to Briefings Direct. Our next thought leadership discussion explores new opportunities for innovation and value among business ecosystem participants. We'll now explore how business and technology platforms have evolved and how third-party businesses and analytics solutions providers are joining forces. To learn how such business ecosystems are incubating new levels of buyer and seller value-added services, we're now joined by Sean Thompson. He's Senior Vice President and Global Head of Business Development and Ecosystem at SAP Ariba. Welcome to Briefings Direct, Sean.
Good morning, Dana. Thank you very much for having me.
We're delighted you're with us. Let's just dive right in. Why is now a good time to up the emphasis on the collaboration inside of business ecosystems? It kind of seems to me that perhaps this has always been a place to collaborate. Why is this different now?
It's interesting, Dana. It's a fascinating time to be alive in terms of when you look at the largest companies on this planet, the 5 most valuable companies, all share from Apple, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook all share something in common, and that is that they have built and host very rich ecosystems, and the platforms that they represent are ones in which not only the host of the platform and the companies themselves enjoy wonderful platform economics, but also the members of that ecosystem enjoy ultimately a very profitable place to do business, whether it's end users that are profiting from the network effect that, say, Facebook has in terms of keeping in touch with friends, and et cetera, or the advertisers that get value from the direct, very specific targeting of Facebook users in terms of what's understood by the end user in terms of interests and values, et cetera. And so it's an interesting time for us to look at not only where those companies have taken us in terms of where we are as an overall economy, but it also is an indication of, in other parts of the technology world, ecosystems really are, especially in the cloud era, becoming more and more important, because in the cloud era, you have this concept of multi-tenancy, where you have the hosts of these applications like Ariba, where we have a multi-tenant platform, if you will, that used to be considered an application that was delivered on premise. Now it's an application that is enjoyed by over 3.5 million organizations around the world. It's hosted by us, by Ariba, in the cloud. And as a result of that, you have a wonderful host, if you will, of an ecosystem that then can evolve around that particular audience and provide value. And for us at Ariba, the opportunity is to really have an open mindset, much like the companies that I mentioned before. So it is a very interesting time. An ecosystem now matters more than ever before in the technology world, mainly because of cloud computing.
Right. So these other companies have created a super value where everybody's a winner, and the more that they play, the more winnings there are for all. It sort of grows the pie. It's a virtuous adoption cycle. Is that how you view a business ecosystem, as a sort of an ongoing value-added creation mechanism? Or how would you define a business ecosystem environment, and how would that be different from, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's interesting. I say this to folks that I work with every day, not only inside of SAP Ariba, but also members of our partner community, our ecosystem. As I say this, is that we are privileged in that not every company can talk about an ecosystem, mainly because you have to have relevance in order for an ecosystem to develop. It's very interesting. I wrote an article recently that it reminded me of, I grew up in Montana. I'm a big fly fisherman, and I grew up with a fly rod in my hand. And it didn't dawn on me until later in my professional life that we used to talk about ecosystem as a kid when we used to talk about the hatches that would happen in terms of the various different bug hatches that would happen where the trout would go crazy. And I was always taught by my dad, certain ecosystems support different bug life and different life of what the trout feed on. And in order to have an ecosystem, whether it was, fly fishing as a kid and talking about the natural environment and the ecosystems that are built, or the business ecosystems that are built today in the software world and in the cloud world, you have to it starts with relevance. Do you have relevance? Much like Microsoft had relevance back when Apple created the PC era, Microsoft decided to license the operating system for the PC to many, and thus became relevant to all the third-party app developers that wanted to write to PCs. Mac was closed. The strategy that Apple had in the beginning was to say that we own and we will control this closed environment that ultimately led to wonderful, wonderful user experience, but it didn't lead to a place where third-party developers could build applications and get them sold, and that's what Windows and the Windows PC environment created, was a profitable place. It had relevance in that many PC manufacturers were using Windows as a standard. Therefore, I, as a third-party app developer, could build and I could then sell the applications that I'm building through a much broader distribution network that was represented by Microsoft's relevance in the early days of PC. It's very similar to any other environment that you talk about ecosystem, and that is it has to have relevance. It has to have relevance in terms of there have to be certain conditions that exist in order for third parties to be attracted. And ultimately, in the business world, it's all about, if you will, profit. Can I enjoy a profitable existence by joining the ecosystem? And at Arriba, I always say that we are privileged because we do have relevance. Salesforce.com had relevance early days when it distributed its CRM app very widely and quite efficiently during the early days of what they pioneered, which was this notion of only needing a username, password, and credit card to distribute and consume a CRM app. And because that CRM app, that mainly a Salesforce automation app, was widely distributed, then all of a sudden you had an ecosystem that started to pay attention because of the relevancy that Salesforce had early with its app, and then thus was able to turn that relevancy of the app into an ecosystem that was based on a platform where they introduced Force.com and they introduced the App Exchange as a place where you could go and find all of the third parties that have ultimately extended the value of that application that now is considered more of a platform. Very similar to what we have here at Arriba is the relevance in the ecosystem that is supported by that market relevance in terms of the network that we have. And so it's a fascinating time.
Let's explore that a little bit. So what is the relevance of Arriba? It seems to me that you're in a very auspicious place between buyers and sellers at massive scale that the cloud allows, and then increasingly the currency here now is data and analytics and insights. So maybe let's explain a little bit more about the relevancy that Arriba has at this point in time in this ecosystem and network of buying and selling.
Yeah, and it goes back to, it's very simple in some ways. It's simple in that, on a professional level, I got to know Arriba back in the 90s. I was at Deloitte during the decade of the 90s, where I was one of those classic reengineering consultants that met enterprise resource planning in the mid-90s during the Y2K era, when companies were needing to consider getting rid of the old mainframes where they thought that the code would fail when the calendar turned over to the year 2000. And so there was a wonderful perfect storm in the industry at that time that really led to the first major wave of consuming enterprise resource planning technology and software. And Arriba was born out of that same era with an eye towards procurement and really helping the procurement organization within companies, that organization that was intended to manage the spend. And enterprise resource planning was really about making spend, efficient, more in organization, making it more efficient overall. not just reducing some of the waste that was inherent within the silos of an organization, but also the waste that was in the way that companies spent money and managed suppliers and managed spend against the contracts that they would have with those suppliers. And so Ariba, not unlike Salesforce and other applications that became relevant, was a first to focus on the buyer. In this particular case, the buyer within Ariba is the procurement organization. How does a software application help a company make better decisions around who they're sourcing their supply with? How are they driving their end users to buy based on the contracts that they can negotiate? And how do you have an end-to-end way of thinking about your source to settle process? That was very much an application-led approach that Ariba has had for the better part of 20 years. When SAP bought Ariba in 2012, it included, Ariba naturally within the portfolio of the largest enterprise resource planning organization of SAP, but instead of back in the day thinking of it as a separate application, now within our SAP we get to think about it within what we call the intelligent enterprise. And within that intelligent enterprise, it's a focus still on how do we make the enterprise more intelligent. And as you say, as we've grown into now becoming more of a cloud-oriented industry, Ariba was one of the first to pioneer moving the app from an on-prem world into the cloud. And by doing so, Ariba also created a network. And it was very early on in pioneering this concept of a network where by delighting the buyer, the procurement organization, that organization also brought their suppliers with them. And Ariba early on had this concept of let's create a network where it's not just one-to-one, point-to-point connections between a buyer and a supplier, but rather let's think about it as a network, as a marketplace where if you bring suppliers in from one buyer, then those suppliers could make connections with many other buyers. And so very early on, the concept that Ariba created was a network. And that network today is now made up of buyers and sellers of over 3.5 million, doing roughly about 2.2 trillion annually of commerce through the Ariba network. And so, as you pointed out, now the currency that we are able to think about, because we are in the cloud, because we are a network and we are multi-tenant, and multi-tenant means that our data model is structured in a way that no one organization is doing one-off things, because we're no longer in an on-prem world where you could customize and start to change the data structure such that it would be very difficult then to integrate all that data structure. Now we live within a cloud environment, and that cloud environment is a consistent data structure where everybody is operating within the same environment, the same code base. And so ultimately now the data that we have within Ariba, within that commerce data set, becomes incredibly valuable to third parties that come in to think about how they can enhance. As an example, we're working with banks today, and banks are very interested and have used our data that we have that can inform new underwriting models so that a supplier can log into the Ariba network someday and see that there are banks that are offering them loans based on data that is available in the Ariba network to inform new loans at better rates because of ultimately capturing the data value that the Ariba network provides. And so this notion of an ecosystem is extending now to very interesting places like banks as a financial services provider being now part of a software ecosystem. And so it's becoming a very interesting time now where we're going beyond the old traditional application, what we used to call independent software vendors that would write to APIs and be thought of as another software company joining an ecosystem. But now we're starting to think about service providers, data providers. And so it's a very interesting time to see the variety of different business models that are joining ecosystems today.
I suppose another catalyst to the power and value of the network and the platform is that many of these third parties now are also digital organizations, that they're sharing their value and adding value as services using APIs, using analytics and standards, so that the integration points have been slashed, and it's much easier for a collaborative solution to come together. Can you give us some other examples, Sean, of where third parties that now enter into a platform and a network, an ecosystem now can add value through, I suppose, digital types of transformative innovation?
Yes. In some ways, Dana, we also, when you look back in my career, 25 years ago, I met SAP for the first time, as I said, when I was with Deloitte. And Deloitte is still a very strong partner of SAP, generally, a very strong player within the technology industry as a systems integrator, consulting organization. And we enjoy relationships with Deloitte and Accenture and IBM and Capgemini and many other organizations today that play a role, as they did in the past, of adding value to the end customer by providing expertise, human capital, intellectual property that is inherent in the methodologies that change management methodologies, business process change methodologies, and there's still a valuable role for these professional services organizations and consultants and the systems integrators that provide today. But their role has evolved, which is a fascinating evolution. It's no longer customizing, as I said, on-prem software. Back in the day when I was at Deloitte, we made a lot of money helping companies adopt an application like an SAP or an Oracle ERP and customizing it. But you ended up customizing for one and building a single-family home, if you will, that was then isolated because you ended up forking the code, if you will, so that you then had a very difficult time upgrading because you customized the code so much that you fell behind. Now in cloud, the systems integrator is no longer customizing on-premise. It's now configuring cloud environments, and that configuring of cloud environments allows for not only the customer to never be left behind, which is a wonderful value for the industry in general, but it also allows the systems integrator to play a new role, and a role that is a hybrid of both consulting and helping companies understand how to adopt and change process and ultimately become more efficient. But they're also becoming, in some ways, software companies themselves, because what they used to do in customizing on-prem, now what they're doing is they're helping build extensions to cloud that can be reused because ultimately it's a cloud offering. And so they can start to think about, how can I create an extension of this particular solution, like Ariba, for certain industries like oil and gas. You'll see SAP continue to evolve its relationships with these service providers in providing extensions to cloud environments that those services companies now start to look like hybrid business models where they enjoy some intellectual property and code as an extension to a cloud environment, as well as monetizing their methodologies like they have in the past. So that's an evolution of a type of ecosystem member that's fascinating to see, and it's really a profitable evolution for those companies because they go from a transactional business model where they have to sell one client at a time and one implementation at a time to start to monetize in a subscription model, much like we in the software world do today and enjoy subscription economics. And so it's a fascinating evolution. And like I mentioned, there's also other examples of new and interesting ways in which, for example, within Ariba, we have a value proposition to the network of buyers and suppliers that we, Ariba, are going to reach out to a third-party ecosystem and gather data additional data about suppliers and sometimes about buyers, but mainly about suppliers and supplier risk, and helping both suppliers and buyers manage risk better in terms of financial risk, in terms of risk being, in a business where your supply chain, you want to ensure that there isn't slave labor in your supply chain or there's diversity in your supply chain. And so the supplier risk category for us is a very important one that's an ecosystem-led provider of data, ultimately, that enriches the supplier profile that we have that can then become an enhancement of the overall value of the network. And so there are examples like that now we are able to reach out and offer ways in which third parties can contribute their intellectual property, be it a methodology or be it data, be it analytics, or be it financial services. And that's what is a really exciting time to be in, given the environment that we're in today.
Right, and so this network effect that you're describing certainly relates to solution sets like financial services and risk management. You mentioned also that it pertains to vertical industries like oil and gas or pharmaceutical, life sciences, financial. Does it also extend to geographics? Is there a localization solution benefit? And then perhaps also going downstream to small to medium-sized businesses that might not have been able to either afford or accommodate this sort of high-level collaboration. So how far do we take this? Can we take it a far field geographically, or can we also go downstream to smaller companies?
Absolutely. It's a great question. I remember the first wave of back to the ERP first wave that I described, where it was really a time in the software industry, especially in the business software industry, that was a major consumption of technology to improve business, and ultimately it led to a tremendous amount of productivity gains that we've enjoyed in seeing the growth of the world economy, even through some of the ups and downs that were built around, or that were the bubbles that were built around asset classes that just inflated to the point where they needed to settle. But ultimately, business productivity through technology has led to a tremendous amount of growth in the economy, and that has been fascinating to see and be a part of. Now, you take it one level beyond where we've been, and your description of, or your ask is, does this extend? And that's what's so fascinating about cloud, and when you combine cloud with a concept of ecosystem, because everybody enjoys a benefit from that. As an example, you mentioned localization. Within Ariba, we're all about business commerce, intelligent business commerce. How can we make in business commerce ultimately more efficient around the world? That's what we're all about. And you go into some of these local countries, business commerce involves, the good old-fashioned, invoicing, orders and invoicing and taxes. And for us, Ariba, we don't want to solve all the last mile of the tax data that is needed in order for invoices to be processed, say, in Mexico. We want to work with members of the ecosystem that do that. Example is Thomson Reuters. We have a relationship with Thomson Reuters, whose business, is in part about managing a database of tax data that is relevant to what's needed in these various different geographies. And so by having one relationship with a large provider of that data and being able to distribute that data to the ultimate end users, who are companies in Mexico, companies in Korea, that need a solution that is going to be compliant with the local authorities and the local regulations and ultimately up-to-date tax data. That's an example of an extremely efficient way for us to distribute to the globe based on, again, cloud and a member of the ecosystem in Thomson Reuters is providing that tax data. Second example you asked about is small and mid-sized businesses. The organization that I was part of prior to Ariba at SAP is a small, mid-sized business organization made up of the portfolio of Business by Design and Business One. These are smaller enterprise resource planning applications that are meant for small, mid-sized businesses. And one of them, Business by Design, is a cloud offering. And I look at what's happening in mid-sized to small businesses. And ultimately, in the past, things that large companies did were too expensive for small and medium. On-prem servers, hardware and software, consultants, and all of the things that large enterprises could afford to drive innovation in the world pre-cloud was ultimately just too expensive for small mid-size. Now all of a sudden, the distribution model that is represented by cloud that I just mentioned, as well as I said before, the multi-tenant nature of solutions that allow for configuration as opposed to customization, which is often costly. Upgrade paths, all the wonderful benefits of cloud, when you combine it with an ecosystem that is meant to support a mid-sized business. For example, within Ariba, we have mid-size consulting organizations who focus on helping mid-sized companies adopt software in an agile way so that it's not big bang, it's not expensive, it's instead prescriptive in terms of how you should start small and grow in terms of adopting cloud solutions. And so that's with a mid-size company mindset that has enabled us to take the same Ariba, no code difference, but just pre-configure it and show up with a prescriptive starting point to say start small, and we like to say at Ariba T-shirt size implementation, small, medium, and large. And so that's an example of how the small, mid-sized business segment is really benefiting from this era of cloud and ecosystem computing that ultimately drives efficiency for all.
And given that the value of any network and ecosystem increases with the number of participants and their participation rates or of activity for buyers, for sellers, for third-party service provider organizations, banks, what should they be thinking in order to get in a better position to take advantage of these new trends, Sean? What should you be thinking as a buyer, a seller, a third party in order to get involved, in order to start leveraging and exploiting this overall benefit for yourself and for your partners and customers?
Well, I will say, just taking on that same go around, I'm about ready to get on an airplane actually and go to South Korea. And some of these geographies where we do business, it's ultimately the profile of some geographies are primarily smaller, mid-size organizations. And when you look at the classic, the pyramid of the number of small, mid-sized businesses, just on that theme, so, staying with that theme of the vast majority of businesses are small, mid-size, even within the United States. And I am still shocked that when I do interact at times with companies that haven't prioritized technology, I am still surprised that there's a lot of industries and a lot of companies in different segments that are still very much analog. They are doing business the way they've been doing business for many years, and they've been somewhat resistant to change because their cottage industries allowed them to maintain Excel spreadsheets, if you will. When I spent a decade of my life at Microsoft, and when we looked at the various different ways Excel was used, we were fascinated by the fact that Excel in many ways was a business system oftentimes that was very precarious because, ultimately you can't manage a business on Excel. But I see that within companies still today, and I think number one thing that every business owner needs to understand is that we are in an exponential time of transformation. What was linear in terms of the way in which we could expect transformation, now we're in this exponential phase where disruption of industries is happening real time and very rapidly. And you have to understand one thing, which is if you're not prioritizing and investing in technology and not thinking of your business as a technology business, then you will get left behind. And so number one thing that any advice that I give to any business owner, leader, et cetera, is to never underestimate the impact that technology can have to drive top-line growth, but ultimately, though, to preserve the option value for your company in the future, because disruption is happening and it's exponential, and cloud, et cetera, is driving that. And so that's number one, is you have to prioritize. And then number two is get advice in terms of how to adopt. And there's a lot, I think, of good, there's good providers for companies that are looking for help. We have many of those within our ecosystem, providers of assistance, whether it's the large systems integrators that I mentioned before, or it's these mid-sized companies that are focused on helping smaller organizations understand how to consume. Because as a fly fisherman, as I mentioned before, I grew up fly fishing, but anybody that comes to me and says, hey, I'd love to go learn how to fly fish, I'd say start with hiring a professional guide. Spend a day on a river with a professional guide, because they will show you how to do things. And I honestly think that same advice would apply, that the professional guide can help you understand where we are today in understanding how to consume cloud software services, et cetera. And ultimately, that professional guide fee is not going to be that much as it was in the past. And so I would say get professional help to start.
All right, well, we're almost out of time, but I'd like to close out with a look to the future. It seems that for third-party organizations that want to find a home in an ecosystem, that there's never been a better time for them to innovate and find new business models, new way of collaborating. You mentioned risk management and financial improvements and efficiency. What would be some of the other areas, as we close out, for innovation and new business models within ecosystems, maybe even particularly or especially within the SAP Ariba network ecosystem? Where are we going to see some new and innovative business models cropping up?
Well, you mentioned it earlier on in the conversation, and that is the future is about data. The future is about insights that we gather from the data. And all of the buzzwords that we see today, I did a post-Microsoft, I started a company in the natural language processing world. I did 5 years of my life in terms of understanding how to drive a new type of user experience using voice, but ultimately it's about natural language understanding and how do you drive domain-specific knowledge of what people want through a natural user interface. And so I've played on the edge of where we are in terms of artificial intelligence within that natural language processing, but ultimately, we're still fiddling in many respects. We still fiddle in the business software arena, talking about chatbots, talking about natural user interface. We're still early, very interesting future, but we're still early in that regard. And we're still very early, frankly, in understanding how to gather insights from data that we have. Like I go back to Ariba. We have a treasure trove of data, 2.1 trillion, 3.5 million members of that commerce network. There is so much data insights. But beyond that, we've got data about contracts, data about, like I mentioned before, supplier profiles. So the future is about being able to harvest insights from data. And we are early. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to ensure that we have not only the infrastructure, like we talk a lot at SAP, the HANA data platform that we have is very exciting to be able to leverage. But we have a lot of work to do still to clean data, to ensure the structure of data, to ensure the privacy of data, security of data. So there's a lot of work still that needs to be done, but man, the future is certainly bright in terms of ultimately someday the way in which we interact with solutions that will be magical in how they're proactive in making recommendations based on understanding the data. Buyers being proactively alerted that something's going on in the supply chain. Being able to predict and be prescriptive in the way in which the software operates. So it is a fascinating future that we have ahead of us. Still a little early, still a lot of work to do, but boy, is it exciting to think about and to be a part of.
Well, great. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. You've been listening to a sponsored Briefings Direct discussion on new opportunities for innovation and value creation among business ecosystem participants. And we've learned how business ecosystems are incubating new levels of buyer and seller value-added services. So a big thank you to our guest. We've been here with Sean Thompson, Senior Vice President and Global Head of Business Development and Ecosystem at SAP Ariba. Thank you, sir. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Dana.
And a big thank you as well to our audience for joining this Briefings Direct Modern Digital Business Innovation discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host throughout this series of SAP Ariba-sponsored Briefings Direct discussions. Thanks again for listening, and do come back next time.